And then today, we will focus on space and terrestrial considerations for access to high energy US proton accelerators for the electronics community. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Ken Labelle. I think a little introduction is needed in the sense that he's really a very key expert in the radiation effects domain with a lot of experience and leadership in a variety of radiation reliability projects, and also having published and having advanced on many different research domains related to radiation effects. So thanks a lot, Ken, for being with us, and the floor is yours. We very much look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ruben. I thank you for the invite, and I very much appreciate being here today. Let's get this going. And there we are. All good with the screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Yep.
Good to hear. So I'm Ken Labelle. I'm actually retired from NASA. I retired a few years ago, about, oh boy, 3.5 years ago now. But I am working part-time supporting NASA as well as a few other folks in the meantime, which means this presentation, since I'm working for NASA, had to go through NASA for clearance. So I'm going to be talking a bit about our use of proton accelerators in the US, mostly for space utilization for electronics, and a little bit about some of the other potential uses for medical facility proton accelerators that we're currently looking at. I'm not going to belabor an acronym chart. I'm going to talk about these in detail. Looks like there's even a duplicate on the last one. So the problem statement is pretty straightforward. Particle accelerators in general we use to do ground-based testing of electronics. The prime thing I worry about is the single particle effects, single event effects, and their application towards risk and qualification of electronics for use in the space and military environments. Protons are obviously used to simulate protons in space, those that are trapped in the planetary magnetic fields, those that are from solar events, and in many cases can be used as a surrogate for neutrons in other environments. So we used to use Indiana University cyclotron facility. It closed very suddenly in 2014. And we were doing at that time about 2,000 hours a year of research for single event effects mostly at that facility. So you lose that, and all of a sudden you start having to do this great proton search. And as proton therapy sites for cancer have been increasing throughout the world, figured that was a good place to start. So we started reaching out to these facilities for access. And it's a very, shall we say, dynamic process. The figure there is courtesy of Bob Weller from about 18 years ago now. It's a 100 MeV proton, the red line, going through a 5-micron silicon block, interacting with a nucleus and causing secondaries to spallate out. These secondary recoils are what actually will deposit energy. And we worry about that for both long-term effects, displacement, for example, and the spallation of particles that can deposit energy and have impacts on our electronics. So why 200 MeV protons? Well, first of all, let's start out with, that's sort of like where the medical proton accelerators are these days, right? Most of them are going to about 230 to 250 MeV protons on the high end, and can be tuned lower. You started the figure on the left, though. These are simulations. Excuse me. These are representative solar events and their proton spectra, looking at the number of particles, the fluence, versus the energy for a slew of different proton solar events for over different time periods. And as you can see, if you look at 200 MeV protons, it does a reasonably good job of bounding the majority of the environment for utilization. Now, why protons do we care about for SEE? It's mostly the secondary effects, the recoil ions. This is a figure courtesy of Ray Ladbury and group at NASA, looking at the reaction of protons interacting with semiconductor materials, silicon in this case, and causing those indirect ionization events from those nuclear recoils. These ions, these secondary ions, typically have a relatively short path length to them, but they do deposit energy, linear energy transfer, the amount of energy deposited per unit length. So you're looking at a modest amount of energy deposition and a fairly short range. So we typically will utilize these for our qualification of electronics in certain environments or as other type of things for, say, screening for heavy ions at lower LETs. Down selecting particular electronics for usage and looking at validating our fault tolerance designs and et cetera. On the other hand, there's terrestrial issues, terrestrial soft error rate. And neutrons are our prime culprit. I'm not going to get into the physical mechanisms of them, but protons do a pretty good job of bounding that neutron spectra. Neutron spectra here, this bottom line, is from the Lance facility in New Mexico, in the US. And you can see 200 MeV protons and the like are listed, and they're all fairly similar to the amount of LET proportionalities that it induces per 10 to the 10th ions. So it does a good job of bounding for the terrestrial issues. So we use them for space, we can use them for terrestrial. So let's look at a little bit at the physics of protons for single event effects. Again, the top table there, I should have given a reference, is from Ray Ladberry et al. It basically looks at the number of ions out versus the number of protons in, looking at just the nuclear production cross sections. And so you're looking at something on the order of a few e to the -6th cross sections. So it takes 1 over that on average to get an interaction in a square centimeter of silicon. So you're only getting a small percentage of your protons entering your silicon that can have a secondary of sufficient energy to potentially cause something for your electronic effects. So again, as we pointed out, there's a distribution of that LET as well as there being short range. So we were worried about the number of interactions, the distribution of them over LETs, and what is that doing for your risk coverage factors for when we're doing testing on the ground. Typically, like when we do heavy ion testing, we're running 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 7th ions for an individual test run. Well, there are a lot of reasons that's a problem for protons, but you would need to go something on the order of 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th to get reasonable type of risk reductions. And those factors you worry about are typically things like dose and displacement damage that happen from protons that don't really happen at the same levels with the heavy ion testing. So you may need more samples of your device to get sufficient statistics. Just a challenge. So sort of the bottom line for heavy ions versus protons, proton facilities are more readily available in the world in general, but insufficient to really qualify our hardware for deep space environments. They're good for some risk reduction factors, but they're not going to replace. And I'm really not going to talk to the words on the left and let you read those. The figure on the right is more telling. So if you take 10 to the 11th protons and do a simulation in, this is a semiconductor device, a really bad, photomicrograph of it. The red dots there on the top represent your proton interactions with the secondaries potentially causing an effect. Well, if you take a 10 to the 7th heavy ion run per centimeter squared, that's the bottom figure. You see a lot more red. So your coverage of your state, your physical states, your physical space is much different with protons unless you go to very high fluence levels. And as I pointed out, caveats are always dose and damage, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also this thing when you're doing testing where protons will activate potential metals and such in your devices and your test systems. So they can cause some secondary issues to your testing and handling of your electronics. A little bit more from Dr. Ladberry and Dr. Lauenstein, looking at, again, the effectiveness of proton interactions. And the figure on the left is it's sort of difficult to see at first glance. You're looking at 3 separate sizes of silicon cubes: a 1 micron cube, a 5 micron cube, and 10 micron cube. And then you're looking at sort of the equivalent LETs that can come out of it on the high end versus different fluence levels for different energies. So what you end up seeing is that you get something in the low teens, typically on the high end, on average, for like 10 to the 12th protons. So your coverage again is on lower LET. It's below that is what you end up seeing quite a bit of. But of course, silicon is not the only thing we worry about in electronics these days. The figure on the right is a sort of simplified version of silicon overlayers and then a tungsten overlayer given some specific thickness levels. And you can see the rise in the tungsten for the LET potential that can come out of the device. Now, this is, of course, not the only things we worry about. There's gallium arsenide, gallium nitride, there's indium phosphide, there's silicon carbide, there's et cetera, all these other basic electronic materials, as well as a number of smaller electronic materials mixed into these devices. And they all can interact with those protons to cause a different reaction product that can come out. So silicon's not the only culprit. We may see other things. So just for talking points, if you take that, solar event chart I showed earlier and sort of break it up nominally, we talk about high energy for space as greater than 100 MeV, kind of that medium energy in that 10 to 100 range, and then the low energy in less than 10 MeV type of range. I'm really going to focus on that right side, because that's sort of where our bounding levels are for the environment and for our testing. So those regimes for electronics testing, for SEE testing, we're really talking about those nuclear recoils, right? We also call indirect ionization. We do rate predictions using the Bendel 2-parameter method, often, sometimes single parameter method, to fit the test data. And it uses data points usually in both the high and medium energy regimes. It does a curve fitting essentially. And then the high energy provides sort of the worst case device sensitivity for go, no go for this type of effect. For SEE testing, for direct ionization, which is that low LET regime, we're talking under 10 MeV. I mean, it's now it's been 14 years since we first published about proton direct ionization and affecting, state-of-the-art electronics. Still something we're concerned about, but it's not the prime discussion for this talk. And then total ionizing dose and displacement damage dose on electronics. Typically, for electronics, we use both medium and high energy protons. The medium energy is sort of the go-to for a lot of technologies like optics and sensors and the such. Low energy will often not have sufficient penetration for a packaged device, but is used for testing of devices such as solar cells. So sort of when we started our great proton search, we came up with some really general rough requirements. So this is sort of what we came up with. What do we need for the high energy? Well, we need something between 125 to something that goes greater than 200 MeV. Typically, the medical accelerators are in that 70 to 250 or 70 to 230 MeV range. We want particle rates per centimeter squared per second that are in the 10 to the 7 to 10 to the 9th. Yes, we'd like higher. Yes, we'd like lower, depending on the sensitivities. But that's sort of, again, that 90% sweet spot. And those fluences, well, 10 to the 9th, 10 to the 11th, or really 10 to the 12th. But that's something facilities have reluctance to do higher fluence levels because of sensitive equipment in the room potentially, or activation that may happen, or neutron monitors that may go off with the secondary neutrons that are formed from those protons throughout the room. The irradiation area is something like a single chip, single IC, or entire board. So we want some range of sizes, 1 to 15 centimeter type of ranges, 225 centimeters squared, right? The beam uniformity is trivial, actually, for medical accelerators, because they need to be really precise when you're treating humans. So 80% uniformity is sort of in the noise for them. They're typically much, much better than even 95% for the uniformity of the beam. And the beam structure is interesting because, they're really, we're used to a cyclotron. That's what Indiana University was. So we basically have a continuous beam. So it's a random particle delivery over time, right? So it's almost a continuous wave beam, and you can have an event happen at any time period. Pulse beam means you have dead time when there's no irradiation. So in certain things, it may cause challenges for your testing, like, oh, well, I'm doing a photonic direct ionization test, and I'm trying to basically do a particle counting and an error rate for those particles. Well, if you have dead time, you're not seeing errors. So you need to factor that into your testing. Not the end of the world, but not always the simplest thing to think about. We typically are used to a fixed spot or a scattered over an area beam. Basically, it's a random particle delivery over area. And the scanning beams, which are I'll talk more about scanning in a few minutes, but basically it's a different type of structure where the beam moves across the target. So some pretty pictures from some of the US facilities we've gone to. The Northwest Medicine Chicago Proton Center. That big blue block here is a beam stop. Beam comes out here. One of the things that's very different between patients being treated for cancer and our electronics is that they want their beam to stop in the patient, basically in the tumor. We want it to go through our patient, basically go through our testing. So we need something to stop the beam on the other end. And not all facilities thought that was necessarily needed because of the way their facility was set up. And I'll show a picture in a few minutes of that. Picture on the right is the Scripps Proton Center, which is now California Proton Center. You can see, beam coming out of the pipe here, a brass collimator that was used for collimating the scattered beam that came out, the robotic sled that they have, which is a patient treatment sled. And these things aren't cheap, by the way. These patient treatment sleds are something over €500,000. So you're going pretty expensive for these state-of-the-art robotic sleds. And personally, the electronics, I wouldn't want to risk myself in many cases on that type of setup for higher levels of testing. And in either case, here's our device under test, going from the collimator to the part, and a table jack, which we brought with us to the facility to raise and lower just manually what's going on. And how do we put our board in? We just clamped it. So it can be very simple. This is a couple more pictures. This is Hampton University in Virginia. The beam here is rotated for a vertical beam line. Beam's going that way and using the ground as the beam stop. But they were radiating through the sled, which I really wasn't a big fan of personally, but that was their choice. And a couple more pictures from Scripps. Really, the point here is there are stray neutrons that are formed through any type of material interaction with protons. So you get those secondaries that are scattered throughout the room. They can hit other electronics on your test board, for example. You can't necessarily eliminate them, but you can do some reduction of them using things like poly sheets or using boron, which is a pretty good neutron absorber. And again, we don't sit in the room with these things. We have to run cables out. So it's always something to pay attention to, is when you're at these medical facilities, where would I sit during a test to see what was going on and control my electronics and see my data? So let's look at the customer base. Again, it's beyond the medical treatments and the research they're doing, because they're doing quite a bit of research in these medical facilities right now. We have our space and military products for electronics, right? We evaluate that proton single event effect risk. It can be a device level, a system level, or something where we're looking at how something is put together in terms of how it's operating, and validation of radiation tolerance, right? We have researchers looking at developing test methods and tolerance of new technologies or design methodologies. And of course, we do things for human protection materials as well, right? because that's all part of what we're trying to put in space. And we actually do fly some instruments that measure stuff. So we actually will use these facilities potentially for doing some instrument calibration. Higher intensity proton machines are often used for isotope production, or in particular for nuclear data research. The intensities here really aren't high enough for medical accelerators for those type of utilization. Not that you couldn't do it, it's just less efficient. And again, I mentioned the surrogate for neutrons on the terrestrial level. Again, commercial electronics, automotive electronics, think of safety critical self-driving cars needing validation for soft errors. And this is a growing area of concern. Aviation and aeronautics, of course, we fly electronics in space, in airplanes and in drones. And the system manufacturers have started using protons for validation at times. And again, it's a growing area as more and more things are being put in the electronics regime up in the for flight. And then in medical equipment, we do have high reliability requirements in them. Again, you don't want your pilot who has a pacemaker to have an upset to his pacemaker while flying, right? So you would like to have a very reliable pacemaker. So let's look at a couple of sample proton single event effect test scenarios. The top figure is sort of the baseline way of testing. You have a board, you have a bunch of ICs on it, and you hit one part. Simple enough. Now, we want to do a larger array of testing. So we're putting boards in, and we're testing large amounts of individual ICs on a single test board. And there's sort of two sub scenarios. You actually can just kind of scan from one to the next, to the next, to the next, or you can hit them all at once. It all depends on what you're trying to do, whether you're looking at system response, or you can have each of these individually instrumented to measure each individual single event effect susceptibility. A lot harder to do for cabling and such, but not impossible, and it actually is a good return on investment type of approach. And then board level testing, for mitigation validation. I have a functional board. I've added some way of mitigating soft errors or single events, and I want to validate it in the Proton B. And you can do these same type of things, and it's sort of a real whole assembly. Have to do a little bit more physics of, what's the particle heat energy here versus here. But, again, for something like a system validation or a very inexpensive type of application, it makes sense. So factors that are increasing are, proton demand from the space side. I mean, it's happening a lot. In general, we're expanding our communities of interest, right? I just showed there's a whole bunch of other folks besides us space people looking to use these facilities potentially. Why are we seeing on the space side? Well, you have a lot more commercial space ventures out there, right? There are new companies, and there are a lot more launches, especially in the small satellite regime. So we're also seeing a lot more constellations. We're seeing a lot more universities. They can't afford, to test every individual device at a heavy ion site. And even if they could, they can't get in. There's really limited time available at heavy ion sites these days. So, protons are often used for some level of risk reduction, or as, say, I take 5 copies of a, different manufacturer's flash memory, put them all in the beam, whichever one tests best, I then maybe do heavy ion, or maybe I just go ahead and use it, right? So using it as a selection tool in one manner or another. And you can test large things, right? In most heavy ion facilities, I can't put a board in and get irradiation on the entire board at one time. I can get a part, a few centimeters maybe. Higher energy facilities like NSRL, which was presented a few months ago, yeah, they can do large systems, but again, that's a one of a kind almost type of setup. And protons will penetrate. In all truth, I always say 60 MeV proton goes through about 7 inches of aluminum. So it goes through a lot of material to get through things. So it's a testability issue. Now, yes, you lose some energy going through material. Yes, you can get straggle on your energy peaks, but for the first order, it can get through a lot of things for testing. So kind of the meat of the stuff here. For the US demand source since 2013 for protons. Well, right here is it's sort of this is an interesting demand study, and I'll say this right up front. This is based on discussions with the facility, not the users. You know, in 2013, there was about 3,000 hours being sold a year. That demand did not drop when Indiana University closed. And what we've gotten here is sort of that trend over time, talking to the facilities about how much they're selling and how much they're turning away because they don't have enough capacity. You can see right here, we're 50% higher than we were in 2013. So in 9 years, 50% growth in the market. I'm not expecting this particularly to drop any. So assume about 4,500 hours a year. There's been a private concern that's been doing their studies, talking to the users, and have come up with a very similar number in the US. So nice to know that what I was getting from the facilities is pretty accurate from the user side as well. So what's affecting our capacity at therapy sites? Well, business model. What we're seeing is a lot of volatility in these therapy sites. We've had ownership changes and management changes. They're in high demand, both the managers and the physicists at these facilities. And what I find is they move a lot. Some of them are staying with the same facilities, but some of them aren't. And often we find things out with very little warning. We're not their prime, customer, right? That's the patients, not the electronics. So we find out late that, oh, they're being sold. Oh, they're going into, Chapter 11 and having to be reorganized, renamed, sold, bankrupt, et cetera, et cetera. Scripps was an example. It's now California Protons, has a different business model than Scripps had. And I'll talk more about Provision in a few minutes and what's going on there. And then the beam costs. For the most part, they sort of can deal with us, but some are trying to put medical cost models on us. For example, one site's problematic, Johns Hopkins University Sibley facility. They're a hospital run by their medical side. And so it's basically two separate things to go through, and the medical side keeps wanting to treat us like a patient. So what they charge a patient through insurance is what they want to charge us, which is probably on the order of about 4 or 5 times higher than we're used to paying per hour. So that's just not a model that works. But they're trying to understand it, and we're trying to help them understand that. There's always the non-interference with patients. Patients come first. That's the prime purpose for these facilities. So we tend to only get access during non-patient treatment hours or regular maintenance hours. And staffing limitations may not allow for extra hours, right? They don't want to have extra staff available to run very often. So they don't want to hire more people that are on a part-time basis. And then there's perceived risk. And I kind of mentioned this with the robotic sleds. There's potential liability and damage to expensive equipment. And few sites have dedicated research rooms we can use that don't have all these secondary things that are problematic necessarily in them. So that there is, whether it's true or not, means you need to understand what the facility looks like, what they're going to allow, and how they're going to allow it. Maintenance and reliability issues. Older machines will fail and need to be refurbed or repaired. So it's a reliability risk. Massachusetts General Hospital, MGH, Francis Burr facility, is one that resembles that. They're back up and running, but they're still not full strength yet. And that's been about a year plus now since their initial reliability repair need. And there's more medical therapy research going on. There's a new type of therapy called flash therapy. Now, it's really interesting in the sense that you're putting a lot of dose on in a very short amount of time. So there's a lot of perceived advantages and potentially even performance advantages for the patients in cancer therapy. However, not all machines can do this. So there are some machines out there that can do flash, short pulse. and some that can't. So that's part of what's being looked at. And sort of there's also a new trend in general. New sites are likely to be a single treatment room. Most of the ones in the past, and the earlier ones in particular, built 5 rooms, for example. So they would treat have a higher patient volume coming in for treatment. Now, with reduced cost for installing a proton accelerator, they're much more effective on the return on investment for doing single rooms. So they're treating fewer patients per hour, but they need smaller staff, less maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. What that means is that there's really not going to be a lot of time for us at those type of facilities. So what are some of the potential business models for them selling protons to us? Typically, it's available hours could be weekends, maybe 1 day a weekend or both days, 12 hours, something like that. Sometimes 2 weekends a month, sometimes 3 out of 4 weekends a month. Can be 1 weekend a month. It can be an 8-hour day, a 12-hour day, or a 16-hour day, all depending on that specific facility and their maintenance requirements and staffing requirements. In a few cases, you can get some time after patient treatment in the evening, maybe 4 to 8 hours. And of course, we're electronics testers. We're used to working in the graveyard shift, wee hours of the night. I've had more fun experiences at 3 a.m. than seeing test results and many other things. Ideally, we'd be able to interleave during a patient treatment hour, right? So make us the lowest priority patient in their scheduling for these multi-room facilities. As soon as we're sort of isolated in a dedicated research room off to the side, we probably get something in all realistic manners of about 15 minutes an hour, which isn't too bad. It's about what we use to test, right? 15, 20 minutes an hour in a 2 to 3 minute block. And it minimizes the additional staffing. Now, the issue there is patient privacy and that isolation. That's not very easy to do in many of these facilities. And of course, if there's no patients being treated, the model changes, right? Now, Provision had a machine that no patients were being treated on that we're able to use during what we call bankers hours, 8 a.m. in the morning to 5 p.m. at night. And the pricing really ranges, right? About $1,000 an hour to about $1,500 an hour is a sweet spot. In some cases, we've seen over $2,000 an hour. It depends a lot on that parent organization. And the real challenge tends not to be the technical. The physicists love us because it's something different for them to do versus treating patients. It's the contracts, it's the way we do the finances with these folks and how we set that up. And we're not medical insurance, right? That's right, they're used to taking for their patient models. So a little background on the proton beam delivery. I mentioned this briefly. There's really 2 types of accelerators out there, cyclotrons, which are a relatively continuous beam structure, and synchrotrons or synchrocyclotrons. Both are pulse beams. In other words, they're a pulse of beam on, dead time, pulse of beam on. We typically call these beam spills. In addition, there are 3 ways that beam comes out. It's a scatter, where you basically have a scattering foil. Protons come in onto a target, scatters out. So you have a field like sort of shown to the right there. There's actually a really good description of of how a cyclotron beam interacts with a target. This wobble or uniform scan, for those old enough like me, you remember a raster scan TV, you're basically taking a scan and just going back and forth across your device, right? Typically back and forth and up and down, but that doesn't have to be 100% that way. That's really an old style. They don't do that much anymore. And then pencil beam scanning. And I always think about that as kind of, I'm 3D printing my protons onto a target. So I'm able to change my energy and intensities, in a very short amount of time in pinpoint motion. And then there's the flash therapy. I mentioned that high dose rate, doing tumor radiation times reduction from minutes, typically like 2 minutes, 3 minutes, down to less than 10 seconds. In the US, it's in the research trial phase, but there's a lot of talk about that. And again, just for consistency, IUCF was a cyclotron, utilized a scattered beam delivery system. And that's sort of still our preference because A, we're used to it, but B, it sort of provides what we need for our tests for the most part. So speaking to a European community, you'll understand I'm being a translator here. I found out very early on how we talk of the physics on the electronics side and what we care about is different than what the medical physicists do when they're doing their work. So you have the medical on the left, the patient, and the electronics on the right. So things like measurement, they care about dose in tissue or water, or what they call monitor counts or units, which you convert to dose in tissue and water. We care about dose in a material and particle rates, right? Fluence, which is protons per centimeter squared, and flux, protons per centimeter squared per second. Well, beam penetration on the patient side, they use the Bragg peak of the proton beam to stop in the patient. Well, we want ours to go through the patient, right? We want to go through the target and need to have a beam stop behind the target. How do they stop? A cumulative dose level, or typically monitor counts or monitor units being set and saying we're going to this level, stop. They do a patient treatment plan that's much more detailed than that. But that's sort of the first order version of it. How do we stop? Well, we've hit a fluence, we've hit a dose, we've hit a certain number of events, or we see some sort of degradation, or something unusual happens, like a blue screen of death on our computer. Some type of event happens. So we have a number of different ways that we stop. They typically have one. Their target size is a tumor size. Our target size varies, right? Single chip to full assemblies. Our beam delivery, the beam deliveries for them is typically that, as I mentioned, pencil beam or wobble or uniform scan, or some type of scatter, type of fixed point thing. We really prefer that point and scatter, right? We want that general randomization over a particle field. The beam timing, yeah, can be important for both sides, but not always on both sides. And it's sort of interesting. That was actually, well, I didn't think it was important to the tumors, but they said it was. And then I had one of the physicists explain it to me, and for the life of me, I can't remember the details enough to explain to anyone else. But they say it is important. Patient exposure, typically it's a few minutes. We're hoping to get a few seconds, but our exposures, seconds to minutes to, well, depending on what your stop criteria is, your fluence levels, your flux levels. Usually we're under 2 minutes, but we're doing a lot more runs on the same target typically, right? We're doing tens of runs to hundreds of runs. They're doing one exposure. And the beam movement is typically a gantry or fixed scan for these facilities. Our beam movement likes to be fixed. We don't really want scanning. We don't want motion. You can actually consider how to use that, but it means more complexity for the facility, and they're probably going to start charging you more to deal with the planning to do so. So let's look at the capacity. I talked about demand a few charts ago. Now I'm talking about capacity, how many hours are actually run, and some estimates for, sort of where we are right now. So in 2013, we had that, 3,000 hours, which is what our quote unquote demand was. That's what we were selling. Then we had a closure at IU, and we dropped down significantly. And actually, we lost some hours in 2014, but here's where it really took effect. And we slowly been ramping up over time, up till 2019. That's getting some of these medical facilities to start selling some time, some more successfully than others. And then 2020, of course, COVID hit, our pandemic. So this is sort of the estimated hours that were sold, with that red here being the estimated loss of hours because of COVID. So it still is the capacity available. So, given this time a year ago, we were in pretty good shape. We had almost 4,300 hours available in the US. Unfortunately, 2022 hit. We had a closure, Provision, February of this year. It was the last beam end of January. And in all truth, we've had a few other challenges along the way from here to here. And in my opinion, we're really down around this 2,036 hour for actual capacity right now. And that's somewhat COVID related still. Some of it is maintenance related. MGH has lost, about 500 hours of estimated capacity for this year. So it's still, we're about half of where we are overall for demand. So who's selling time? And I'll point out a few things along the way here. Our prime locations in the US, some have been around a while, like the James Slater facility, which is most people call Loma Linda. They're selling on a regular basis. They do weekend access. The Mayo clinics, both in Phoenix and Rochester in the US. Rochester has pretty much reached their limit for what they're going to sell. Phoenix has some time available at times. Mass General's been struggling since unexpected maintenance from last year. It's really, I've talked to Ethan at the facility on a fairly regular basis. They're something less than half of what they were pre-COVID due to, their maintenance related issues. They're able right now one Saturday, as opposed to Saturday and Sunday when they do SE to allow us electronics users in. Northwestern Medicine Chicago Proton Center, they're doing well, actually. They're selling on a regular basis. They're booked well in advance. And then the one with the line cross through, Provision Cares Proton Therapy in Knoxville, Tennessee. New management. So Provision went into bankruptcy. The new owners who bought it, Covenant Health, basically said, we don't want you guys doing this anymore. We want that machine out of here. Well, there's still some stuff going on with that and discussion on options. But they basically stopped taking users as of after the end of the first month of this year. This was the US site that had the most access for testing, had about 1,500 hours a year, and the only quote unquote dedicated research accelerator for single events at Centra. And there are a couple of intending to sell. Johns Hopkins University Proton Therapy Center, which, as I mentioned, has the issue related to how they take money and how much they want to charge. And then a small single room facility in Alabama, University of Alabama, Birmingham. They intend to. They've been intending to for 2 years now. Still haven't gotten any time there. I saw Camille was on. Triumph is a tremendous facility in Canada. I'm keeping that sort of out of the equation here. Not that we don't want to use it, but we're still going back and forth with how do we get there, especially with those in the US government. Taking things across boundaries, even to Canada, can be troublesome at times. And the thing we've really seen here is that no guaranteed access facility exists domestically in the US. The mix is who are selling. Actually, I do a quarterly update, and it seems to change significantly every quarter. It's been actually fairly consistent for the first 2 quarters of this year, unfortunately, not good. So sort of putting those capacity and demand together, you see that big gap here on the right. The gold line is the estimated demand in hours. And if you really think you're about here at 2000, our demand's about twice our capacity, which means Camille and group at Triumph ought to be really busy with the commercial folks who can get there. So what's some possible options? So I didn't talk about this, but our heavy ion access issues are even worse. I mean, really even worse. And they're the priority within the US for finding solutions. So finding our solutions for proton issues and the funding to do so is not quite as simple. We've gotten some funding for heavy ion related solutions. We have not found it yet for proton related solutions, albeit we're discussing. As I pointed out, Proton Therapy Center is not guaranteed. There's issues with insurance acceptance for patients, whether insurances will accept proton versus a traditional other type of radiation therapy. The patient loads are uneven. In other words, utilization rates of these facilities is all over the place. Some are really highly utilized and some not as much. And then there's this whole flash therapy thing, right? Versus the other ways they do irradiation. How will that affect the equation? And there's newer therapies coming out, carbon ion therapy. There are some in the US. but there's some not in the U.S. and there's one being built in the U.S. But again, getting approval for utilization and all that for patient treatment is a different equation. But again, in theory, it's more efficient irradiation with less peripheral damage to the cells around it. How will that change our accessibility? And there are possibilities out there. Excuse me. Provision gets resurrected. We get find funding. They decide to keep it operating at that facility. Someone finds funding, whether it's public or private in the U.S. for a new facility, or another site goes under bankruptcy, and we find somebody to buy it and operate it. We don't need the full medical facility. In all truth, we won't need something much simpler than that, but we'll take what we can get. So sort of my summary and comments, really just comments. What we really need is a better demand study, right? We have generalities. We actually need what that industrial group has done, just take the users to create a more appropriate demand signal by finding out what do you actually need versus what the facility is telling us. Private industry has expressed interest in solving this problem. There's at least 3 groups out there trying to solve it with some type of public-private venture. Again, is there reuse potential for these older or financially challenged sites? Medically installed machines have lots that we don't need in that building. Sort of interesting. The facility outside of Houston, Texas, that has been a long time facility for proton therapy, is putting a new accelerator in. And they have no idea what they're going to do with the old accelerator there, other than they're not going to treat patients with it and likely not going to want us to do work there. But that's an example of, well, these machines are getting older and they maybe even be replaced, and what can we do? Can we get access somehow to those machines? There's 38 or so proton therapy sites active in the US, and more are being planned and being built as we speak. And we may be able to get some additional access, but given the volatility we've seen over time, some uncertainty exists for stable access, except for a few of the sites. MGH has been pretty consistent. Loma Linda has been pretty consistent. Northwestern now is very consistent. And with that, I think that's my last slide.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Ken. This was a super interesting talk. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we will soon go to the round of question. I will just steal another couple of minutes, hopefully now in full view, and also profiting from the fact that we have quite a number of people connected, or over 60 participants. So again, this is just to remind you the key points that we do have an open call for beam time until the end of June. These open every 3 months. So those of you interested in submitting proposals, please consider doing so. A few of these facilities are high energy proton related. For instance, Ken mentioned Triumph. So Triumph is a part of RADNEXT. So there is beam time that can be accessed free of cost to the users, but through a proposal and with the commitment by the users to publishing the data. So this is Triumph, but there's also PSI and ParTrek, formerly KVI. So these are the 2 European plus Canadian facility offering high energy protons. And of course, there's a broad range of other particles, heavy ions, neutrons, and even more exotic flavors. Again, we had the annual meeting recently. We've already assigned 1,500 hours in the first year. I think this is quite a lot if we compare it, for instance, with what Ken was mentioning of the total demand. Of course, this is overall, this is including ions, protons, and neutrons. And we do see, as Ken was suggesting, that there's a big bottleneck, especially for heavy ions, but protons and neutrons are also definitely in high demand. And we also have a repository of the test reports that have already been completed, or the summaries, I would say, not full reports of some of the tests that have already been executed within RADNEXT. And again, these are the 3 seminars that we've had so far, including the one that we just had the pleasure to listen to now. Next one will be after the summer. Typically, we announce it at the end of each seminar, but as we will have a bit of a gap in July and August, stay tuned on the social media and our website for further information. And with this, I thank Ken again. I stop the share, we stop the recording, and then we go to the questions and the discussion. So those of you eager